advised by minority staff that Ms. Wild is okay with starting. We usually like to extend that courtesy, but she will be here shortly. So thank you. This hearing of the Subcommittee on Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations will come to order. Today we will turn our attention again to the evil of human trafficking and discuss ways the United States government, both Congress and the administration, can combat this abhorrent crime more effectively. This is the 43rd congressional hearing that I've chaired on human trafficking. Unfortunately, there is much more to be done. Around the globe, an estimated 28 million people are enslaved in labor or sex trafficking, with traffickers profiting about $236 billion annually. Today, we will specifically examine the 2024 Annual Trafficking in Persons Report, or TIP report, which the Department of State released just 2 weeks ago on June 24th. And I would just note parenthetically, getting the TIP report established, because I wrote the original law, was so hard. There were people in the administration who said, just put it into the country reports on human rights practices, make it a part D or C or a subheading somewhere, and not its own report. And we fought very hard in a bipartisan way to get that enacted, but it was very vigorously opposed and then finally, thankfully, accepted. As I was indicating, almost 25 years ago, I authored the historic Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. Once again, the TVPA is up for reauthorization. My good friend and colleague, Ranking Member Wild, and I have a House passed bill, H.R. 5856, the Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Prevention and Protection Reauthorization Act of 2023. I'll have to change that to 2024 when the Senate, God willing, passes it. It did pass the House this past February by an overwhelming margin of 414 to 11. I do call on my friends and colleagues in the United States Senate to take it up. I've reached out to them continually, respectfully, but continually and urgently. This vital legislation should be enacted without haste to let governments, civil society, the bad guys, the purveyors of this heinous practice, and especially the victims and survivors know that we have not stopped fighting or caring about this vital human rights issue. The reauthorization of key domestic and international programs and funding, including the State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, the role of the ambassador at large, and the continuation of the annual TIP report are all contained in the bill. It is time to get this bill to the President's desk. It should have been there a long time ago, but let's do it now, before this session ends and we start all over again in the next session. The TVPA is a whole-of-government approach, as I think many of you know, to combat sex and labor trafficking in the United States and around the world. It puts forward a comprehensive counter-trafficking in persons strategy that integrated the 3 Ps: protection for victims of trafficking, prosecution of the traffickers, and prevention of human trafficking in the first place. And sometimes we add a 4th for the partnership, since none of us can do it alone. And if we want to be successful, we need those friends and allies across civil society and, of course, in other governments. Among the law's many provisions was the creation of an annual TIP report. It's written by the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons at the State Department, and analyzes countries' efforts to meet certain minimum standards for elimination of human trafficking. The tier rankings in the TIP report is a vital tool for the United States government to fight human trafficking. It's also a great mirror for those, and believe me, I meet with delegations all the time who object to parts of it, and when you really get down to it, they agree that what we're saying often is right, but they don't like to be called out. And it's very important that we be willing to speak truth to power in that way. It is the gold standard for pushing governments to reform their own laws, prosecute criminals, and take strong measures to end trafficking in their countries. The TIP report only works when it judges governments strictly based on the minimum standards for fighting human trafficking as laid out in the TVPA as amended. Political considerations cannot seep into the report. And I would note parenthetically there, in the past we have had that happen, where there were ambassadors and there were others, assistant secretaries and regional, who fought hard to keep their country or countries off the Tier 3 rating. That's totally unacceptable. That sells out the victims, as we all know, and I know the Honorable Cindy Dyer knows that so well, and very often there is a fight. Now, differences of opinion are inevitable, but when it's being done for other purposes and other parts of the agenda, absolutely unacceptable. Call it the way it is, and then decide what is the best application of the prescribed sanctions and the like in the bill. I was glad to see this year that the TIP report, the world's top violators of human rights, countries such as China, Cuba, North Korea, Iran, Belarus, Russia, and Nicaragua, rightfully remain ranked in Tier 3. I was also glad to see that the TIP report highlighted Cuba's and China's role in state-sponsored forced labor, but we can still take this a step further by having the tier ratings take into consideration the countries who participate and purchase that forced labor, including from Cuba's foreign medical missions. Likewise, Laos was rightfully downgraded to the Tier 2 watch list, in part due to a human trafficking threat rapidly emerging out of Southeast Asia, where Chinese transnational organized crime syndicates operate scam centers with impunity. Bordering Laos and both Burma and Cambodia remain in the Tier 3 designation. These criminals traffic innocent people from all over the world, luring them to prison compounds with fake job advertisements and offers. Only once these victims arrive at apartment blocks surrounded by armed guards and barbed wire do they realize they're hooked, they can't escape. Victims are forced to work in these compounds, conducting elaborate online cyber-currency scams known as pig butchering. Forced by their traffickers to communicate digitally with unsuspecting scam victims, including in the United States, scam center workers attempt to strike up a text through WhatsApp or even through phone conversations to gain trust and build relationships. Victims are then tricked into depositing money into fraudulent so-called crypto investment platforms controlled by the scam center. Once enough money is deposited, the scammer withdraws the money, deletes the fake account, and disappears. Through the dystopian fraud, innocent Americans are being robbed of their life savings. Estimates of money stolen from Americans through pig butchering scams are now over $3.5 billion. And without a whole government effort, the problem will likely only get worse. Yet pig butchering is a double crime. It destroys the lives in the U.S. by robbing unsuspecting victims of their life savings, while it also is destroying the lives of the trafficking victims in Southeast Asia through forced labor. Most of these scam centers are in Burma, Laos, and Cambodia. These countries' governments need to act to shut down these vile operations to help free the forced labor victims, over 300,000 of them by 2023, and bring the perpetrators to justice. Neighboring countries such as Thailand, Singapore, and Vietnam also do little to combat the rampant human trafficking occurring on and through their borders, as well as the money laundering occurring through their financial institutions. Unlike the appropriate tier rankings for Laos, Cambodia, and Burma, I would argue that Vietnam, and I've been pushing this for years, I've traveled there, I've met with human rights activists in Vietnam and victims. Vietnam does not warrant an upgrade from Tier 2 watch list to Tier 2. We cannot reward the Communist Party of Vietnam for repeatedly misleading the U.S. on its weak efforts to combat human trafficking. Civil society organizations have reached out, concerned about Vietnam's sham upgrade to Tier 2 status due to their lack of transparency and accountability for government officials. That said, I was pleased to see that under the topics of special interest, the mention of trafficking for the purchase of organ removal and forced organ harvesting. I have a bill, H.R. 1154, the Forced Organ Harvesting Act of 2023. It passed the House 413-2 in March, not of this year, of last year. Can't get that out of the Senate either. This bill imposes property, passport, and visa blocking sanctions on persons, individuals, and entities involved in forced organ harvesting or trafficking in persons for the purpose of organ removal. The Frederick Douglass bill also contains a provision to permanently include in the TIP report information about the trafficking in persons for the purpose of organ removal, including cases and steps governments are undertaking to prevent, identify, and eliminate such trafficking. Before closing, I'd like to mention one more troubling development. Recent years have seen the rise of a disturbing new normalization of so-called sex work, intergenerational sexual partnerships, or transactional, sex. These terms are pushed by certain NGOs, international organizations, and government organizations alike, and they advocate for legalized prostitution. Not only do these terms subtly undermine U.S. law in the TVPA, which defines sex trafficking and personal sex acts, they also attempt to normalize sex trafficking and the sexual abuse and exploitation of children. Let's be clear. The TVPA defines the term commercial sex act as any sex act on account of which anything of value, anything, is given to or received by any person. And any commercial sex act in which the person is induced to perform such acts and has not attained the age of 18, it is called sex trafficking under the TVPA. And that was a landmark change we got in the year 2000 when it was signed into law. I was shocked and disturbed to see that Belgium was upgraded to Tier 1 after passing a new law in May of 2024 on legalizing the role of third parties, including pimps and madams, and treating exploited women as employees and holding them to account for refusing sex acts. Congress must stand with the disturbing ideological trend. I agree fully with UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls, Reem Aslem, who wrote in June of 2024 in her report to the UN Human Rights Council. She said, and I quote, "Prostitution reduces women and girls to mere commodities and perpetuates the system of discrimination and violence that hinders their ability to achieve true equality. Given the immense harm experienced by women and girls in prostitution, it is important to use terminology that aligns with international human rights law and standards. Terms like sex work sanitize the harmful reality of prostitution. Prostitution is not a liberating job choice. Sex trafficking should not be called sex work. Responsible governments, organizations, and advocates have a duty to fight this disturbing and twisted ideological trend." Today, we will hear, and I am deeply grateful to our witnesses, from Ambassador Cindy Dyer, Ambassador at Large to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, and from Jason Towers, Burma Country Director at the United States Institute of Peace and an expert in Southeast Asian trafficking scam centers. I would like to now yield to my good friend and colleague, Susan Wild, for any comments you might have.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for convening this. Thank you to our witnesses. I am, as always, appreciative of the opportunity to have this hearing. As I stated in our last hearing on this subject, combating the scourge of human trafficking, especially among children, but not exclusively, should never be a partisan issue. Chairman Smith, I am proud to have worked with you and other members across the aisle on this priority, and I look forward to continuing that work. The release of the 2024 Trafficking in Persons, TIP report, is an opportunity to take stock of the progress we have made and the enormous amount of work that remains to be done. In my view, our priorities remain the same as those I articulated in our last hearing: engaging in robust, principled diplomacy, both bilaterally and in international fora, reporting on countries consistently and without regard to political pressure or geopolitical considerations, and being willing to take on powerful interests, including very profitable corporations that benefit from the appalling reality of child labor. To all the advocates and survivors who may be here today or may be watching this hearing, please know that we stand with you and we will continue working on your behalf. And with that, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. I'd like to recognize Mr. McCormick. Dr. McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Are we doing questions right now?
No, just any opening comments? Or?
I appreciate you all being here. This is an extremely important topic. Recently got back from Bangladesh for the Cox's Bazar area, which obviously has some issues with the 1 million people in about 13 square kilometer area where child labor and human trafficking and child trafficking is a massive problem. But we have our own problems here in the United States, so I'm looking forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Wild, as well as my fellow members here, and thank you to the panel for attending today. I appreciate your time and explaining to us a lot of questions that we may have. Being from Guam, I'm very interested in the Indo-PACOM area, and we'll be asking you a few questions. I appreciate your support today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If Ambassador Cindy Dyer, and thank you again for being here and for your service, serves as the United States Ambassador at Large to monitor and combat trafficking persons and leads the Department of State's Office to Monitor and Combat Human Trafficking. Ambassador Dyer is a human rights advocate and lawyer with 3 decades of experience working at the local, national, and international levels to prevent and respond to human trafficking, sexual assault, and domestic violence. In December of 2022, the Senate unanimously confirmed Ambassador Dyer to lead the United States global engagement in combating human trafficking, and they made a very wise choice. For 12 years, she was the Vice President for Human Rights at Vital Voices Global Partnership, an international NGO advocating and advancing women's leadership, where she worked to assess, improve, and implement policies related to human trafficking and gender-based violence. Prior to joining Vital Voices, she served in a presidential appointment as the Director of the Office of Violence Against Women within the U.S. Department of Justice, where she served as the liaison between DOJ, federal, state, tribal, and international governments on matters involving violence against women. Ambassador Dyer began her career serving as a specialized domestic and sexual violence prosecutor in Dallas, Texas, and did that for more than 13 years. We then will hear from Jason Tower, who is the Burma Country Director of the United States Institute of Peace, and also serves as the Director of USIP's Program on Transnational Crime and Security in Southeast Asia. Mr. Tower joined the USIP in 2019, has over 20 years of experience working on conflict and security issues in Asia. Since 2020, he has also conducted extensive research and published widely on the rising influence of Chinese origin crime groups across Southeast Asia, particularly in Myanmar. Mr. Tower is one of the first experts to begin documenting the sudden rise of forced labor scamming in mainland Southeast Asia. Since early 2022, he has played a key role in shining light on this poorly understood but rapidly growing instance of human trafficking. Thank you for being all here today, and I yield to Ambassador Dyer such time as she may consume.
Thank you. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Wild, and distinguished members of this subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the 2024 Trafficking in Persons Report, or TIP report, which was released on June 24th, and the Department of State's efforts to monitor and combat human trafficking worldwide. The TIP report, which my office produces annually, contains narratives detailing global anti-trafficking efforts of 188 countries and territories, including the United States. It is the world's most comprehensive resource of governmental anti-trafficking efforts, including our own, and reflects the U.S. government's commitment to global leadership on this key human rights, law enforcement, and national security issue. This year's TIP report includes 19 downgrades, with 17 downgrades from Tier 2 to the Tier 2 watch list, including Hong Kong, Laos, Malta, Rwanda, and Uruguay. And 2 countries, Brunei and Sudan, downgraded to Tier 3. There were 22 countries whose rankings improved, including 3, the Republic of Korea, Poland, and Suriname, who were upgraded to Tier 1, and 5 upgraded from Tier 3. Notable upgrades to Tier 2 include Bolivia, Botswana, Bulgaria, Egypt, Malaysia, South Africa, and Vietnam. The 2024 TIP report documented several continuing and emerging global trends. First, we continued to track forced labor within Cuba's medical missions across 53 countries, the PRC's Belt and Road Initiative, and other PRC-affiliated projects in 32 countries, and DPRK workers exploited abroad in 19 countries. Second, the department newly documented that Russian authorities, middlemen, private military companies, or Russian-affiliated forces used coercion, deception, and, in some cases, force to recruit foreign nationals, particularly Central and South Asian migrants, as well as citizens from Cuba and Syria, as fighters in support of Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. And third, the report highlights the continued growth of online scam operations, with centers emerging in new regions and victims recruited from an expanding list of source countries. While the tier rankings are important, the TIP report is, above all, the U.S. government's principal diplomatic and diagnostic tool to guide relations with foreign governments on human trafficking, with the narrative and recommendations providing a roadmap to improvement, and the rankings a means to encourage governments to increase and improve their anti-trafficking efforts year after year. In addition to narratives outlining steps governments are proactively undertaking to combat trafficking, the 2024 TIP report also implicates additional governments in perpetrating the crime itself, with a policy or pattern of trafficking, now including 13 countries, with Belarus added back to the list and Sudan newly added, alongside 11 countries that have remained on the list, including Cuba, DPRK, PRC, and Russia. This year's TIP report introduction examines the role of digital technology in the fight against human trafficking. In particular, it highlights how traffickers use digital technology in perpetuating and facilitating human trafficking, but also how digital technology can be used effectively by the anti-trafficking community to monitor and combat this heinous crime. One example of the nexus of human trafficking and digital technology is the phenomenon of online scam operations, often run by local PRC national operated crime syndicates. These scam centers have been predominantly located in Southeast Asia, primarily in Burma, Cambodia, and Laos. The 2024 TIP report documents the expansion of online scam operations from Southeast Asia to countries in the Western Hemisphere, Europe, Africa, and the Gulf, ensnaring victims from more than 60 countries. But digital technology can also contribute to the solution as well. For example, digital technology can be used to disseminate information to help prevent trafficking and assist victims. It can also empower law enforcement to uncover a digital trail, helping bring perpetrators to justice. Addressing human trafficking in today's world requires an understanding and use of digital technology to uncover evidence of trafficking, protect victims, prosecute perpetrators, and ideally prevent this crime. These efforts will require governments, law enforcement, technology companies, and civil society to work together to develop and utilize innovative technologies and approaches to address today's and tomorrow's challenges. The introduction to this year's TIP report also addresses other areas of interest, including Cuba's coercive labor export program, in which tens of thousands of workers, the majority of whom are medical professionals, are sent around the world, but often have their wages taken by the Cuban government and are not free to leave the program. Other topics of special interest include forced marriage, trafficking in persons for the purpose of organ removal, the intersection between trafficking and persons with disabilities, and the importance of worker empowerment as a tool in combating labor trafficking. The TIP office remains committed to listening and centering the voices of those with lived experience of human trafficking, partnering with survivors in meaningful ways, from drafting sections of this year's TIP report introduction to advising us on our programming, is critical to establishing effective, victim-centered, trauma-informed, and culturally competent anti-trafficking policies and strategies that address prevention, protection, and prosecution. Survivor input is a central tenet of the federal government's approach to combating human trafficking. As a movement, we must engage survivors early and often in the development of our policies and programs. Allow me to share a few recent examples of State Department survivor engagement. This year, we were honored to have members of the U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking join the U.S. delegation at meetings of the Organization of American States and at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, delivering remarks on the importance of survivor leadership in anti-trafficking work and other topics such as prevention strategies. A council member again joined the cabinet officials and other leaders from across the government in the February meeting of the President's Interagency Task Force to monitor and combat trafficking in persons. The TIP office has increased funding for locally based and survivor-led initiatives through its foreign assistance programming. Earlier this year, we invited organizations to submit applications to provide technical assistance to foreign governments, civil society organizations, and public international organizations to establish survivor leadership and partnership structures around the world. While modest in size, our foreign assistance programs, which include bilateral and regional initiatives, child protection compact partnerships, and our research-driven, evidence-based program to end modern slavery projects, punch far above their weight in terms of reach and impact. Our multi-year phased approach means that as of the start of this year, we have more than 100 bilateral and regional projects in 84 countries, totaling over $240 million. On the same day we launched the TIP report, we also put out a solicitation for proposals to address recommendations in the report. This includes potential new programming touching priority issues in every region of the world. For example, potential projects focused on online scam operations and reducing the reliance on victim testimony in criminal justice proceedings in the Western Hemisphere, as well as addressing human trafficking in the Belt and Road Initiative. We are also working to establish child protection compact partnerships with several governments, and earlier this year, we launched the Partnership to Prevent Trafficking in Persons with the government of Zambia. This P2P program builds on the partnership model of the CPC program, but expands the anti-trafficking efforts to focus on adults as well as children. As long as there is a profit motive to exploit other human beings for gain, trafficking is at risk of existing. But working together, whether across the aisle or across the ocean, we can work to end this abhorrent practice. So again, thank you for all of your support, and especially Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Wild, and Representatives Salazar, Amata, and Manning, as well as House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman McCall, for shepherding the Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Prevention and Protection Reauthorization Act of 2023 through the House. I very much hope to see passage of a Trafficking Victims Protection Act reauthorization this Congress. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your testimony and leadership. I'd like to now turn to Mr. Tower.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Wild, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to be here to speak to the growing threat that forced labor scamming represents to the United States and to global security. The United States Institute of Peace is an independent, nonpartisan institute established by the U.S. Congress that works internationally on the prevention and mitigation of violent conflict and to support U.S. national security interests overseas. I'll be speaking today to the findings of a new USIP Senior Study Group report that was published in May of 2024, titled Transnational Crime in Southeast Asia, A Growing Threat to Global Peace and Security, as well as to ongoing research undertaken by USIP on issues related to forced labor scamming and the role that especially Chinese origin crime groups play in this new form of crime. Since 2022, a new form of highly sophisticated online scamming known as pig butchering has emerged as a growing threat to US national and global security. And I would say at this point that we really face a global security crisis as a result of this new form of criminality. Pig butchering involves establishing a relationship of trust with a target over an online platform, often this being a romantic relationship through which the perpetrator asserts psychological control over the victim, and ultimately the victim is compelled into investing everything that she or he owns into a fraudulent online cryptocurrency platform. The perpetrator then disappears with the funds, and in most cases around the world, victims are not only unable to recover their worldly possessions, many of them are often left deeply depressed, and we're also seeing growing instances of suicide among those who've been impacted by these scams. This form of scamming is being perpetrated by transnational organized crime groups from the People's Republic of China, based in Southeast Asia, where they have relocated over the past 2 decades, and where they've established a web of elite influence, and in some instances have even taken over control of territories, establishing criminal zones from which they can engage in criminal activity in impunity. These PRC origin crime groups have set up thousands of compounds to house these pig butchering scams across the region. And they're presently spanning out of the Southeast Asia region into other parts of the world, notably into Dubai and into Africa. The US lost over $3.5 billion to these scams perpetrated by the Chinese origin crime groups out of Southeast Asia in 2023. And that's only the amount that has been reported, noting that the majority of the cases go unreported. Globally, USIP found that these criminal groups steal over $63 billion per year from people in more than 100 different countries. They have powered these scams using forced labor, tricking hundreds of thousands of people into cyber slavery through online recruitment scams, another form of scamming, which involves enticing victims with the promise of high-paying jobs, only to traffic them into forced labor conditions where they're subjected to torture, often threatened to be sold into slavery and other compounds if they do not successfully scam or meet very aggressive targets by the scam syndicate operators. Nationals of 66 countries, including the United States, have been trafficked or otherwise tricked into these scam compounds. This is happening on an industrial scale in 3 countries, Myanmar, Cambodia, and in Laos, but is also found in the Philippines, and again, it's spreading further around the world with evidence of these scam syndicates having been found in several different jurisdictions. The scams depend on the criminal actors maintaining free and open access to a full range of social media platforms and recruitment websites. So many of the victims, both of the scams, the pig butchering scams, as well as human trafficking, are targeted over common platforms such as Facebook, WhatsApp, WeChat, TikTok, or LinkedIn. These criminal groups also maintain deep ties in mainland China, with much of the infrastructure that houses these scam syndicates today actually being built by Chinese state-owned enterprises, which accepted lucrative contracts from the Chinese crime groups to build the infrastructure where these victims of human trafficking and forced labor scamming are now held. The criminal syndicates have also built deep relationships in almost every country in Southeast Asia, where they tap into key cross-border resources needed to fuel the scam centers. This includes using countries such as Thailand and Vietnam as transit countries for victims of human trafficking, using Singapore, the Philippines, and Malaysia to launder funds and to develop new financial tools and cryptocurrency products that are used in the scams, as well as really targeting every country in the Southeast Asia region with forced labor scamming. And we're seeing that actually the region and the countries of ASEAN are some of the hardest hit countries, both in terms of losses to the scams, as well as trafficking victims into scam centers. This activity now represents a direct threat to US interests at home and abroad. According to US authorities, Americans are now targeted more than any other group in the world by these scams. This is being accelerated by an aggressive crackdown that the Chinese government has undertaken since 2022 on scams that are targeting Chinese nationals. The result is that the Chinese origin crime syndicates are adapting. China reported a 30% decrease in these scams over the past 8 months, while the US reports unprecedented losses as many of the criminal syndicates have pivoted to targeting more Americans and targeting more of a global population. These trends also undermine years of US investments in countering human trafficking. For the first time, you're seeing countries like Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos become destination countries of human trafficking. And according to a recent report by Interpol, anyone, anywhere can now become a victim of trafficking simply by applying for a job online. Another threat to the US stems from China's response to these crimes. With many countries becoming more desperate to find a solution, China is leveraging this issue to strengthen the influence of its police and its authoritarian form of policing around the globe, enhancing also its security influence, which threatens US investments in democracy, governance, and human rights. Sadly, the response to this phenomenon to present is limited, ad hoc, and uncoordinated. Awareness of the pig butchering scams in the US and many other countries around the world remains low. Law enforcement is not tooled with the technologies and skills needed to trace and seize, especially cryptocurrency. That is the main form of currency stolen by these scams. Social media companies are not held accountable when their platforms are used to traffic victims or to steal billions of dollars from unsuspecting victims. Resources for victim response are also limited given the new patterns and victims of human trafficking and the traditional organizations that are responding not being tooled with resources needed to support those victims. When it comes to human trafficking into the compounds, efforts are also very ad hoc. Recent cases of victims from Morocco and Uganda that were trafficked into Myanmar required that senior officials from those countries be sent out to the region to engage in weeks of negotiations with criminals and armed groups in Myanmar controlling these compounds, with many of the victims being injured or even killed trying to get out. In other cases, families have paid large ransoms to extract their relatives that have been trapped in these centers, with there being instances of people paying up to $100,000 to retrieve their relatives from the scam centers. Others have been treated as criminals rather than victims of trafficking when being brought out, and this is happening especially in the People's Republic of China, but then also across the region more broadly. In our USIP Senior Study Group report on these issues, we identify this as a growing threat to global peace and security. And we urge that the US considers a whole of government response to this phenomenon of forced labor trafficking. Potentially, this could be led by the National Security Council, which could establish an interagency task force to steer this effort both at home and abroad, as well as to assert US leadership on this issue internationally. The report also looks at other options, including advancing much more robust international cooperation to systematically constrain the criminal networks that are behind these scams. This may require leveraging sanctions or other punitive measures to target the malign actors that are behind these scams, including elites in countries that continue to provide criminal actors with protection in Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos in particular. The report also looks to increase investments in the gathering and sharing of information on all aspects of the forced labor scamming industry, and in the building of the capacity of law enforcement and regulatory agencies to recover funds, particularly by enhancing capacities to trace cryptocurrencies. It also suggests engaging in a nationwide public awareness raising program to protect US citizens, and also that the US support similar awareness raising programs internationally. The other recommendations include investments in prevention of new forms of technology-fueled human trafficking, focusing specifically on mobilizing active involvement of the private sector in reversing some of these trends in the social media space. And lastly, we call to hold the PRC accountable, given that it was in fact the People's Republic of China that played a significant role in enabling this current crisis. Look at demanding that China share intelligence on these issues and take decisive action to prevent Chinese origin crime groups from harming the United States, in maybe a similar manner as to what we've done around the fentanyl crisis. Thank you for inviting me to testify, and I look forward to questions.
Mr. Dyer, thank you very much and for highlighting a seriously underappreciated and unacknowledged problem that's happening, as well as your other work. Thank you for that. I would like to ask a couple of questions and yield to my colleagues that I have more questions I would like to pose. But I'd like to start off with the whole issue. Remember last time, Ambassador Dyer, I asked you about the unaccompanied minors, the 85,000. That was the generally accepted number of those coming across our border who we had lost contact with. Did not know. I mean, I reached out to Homeland Security, as you recommended, and we still don't know what happened to those kids. And that number could be far in excess of that now. We don't know. It probably is. And HHS as well, but Homeland Security is what you had recommended. We reached out to both. And I'm wondering, what can be done? Are we trying to track those kids? Find out where they are? I mean, I'm a great advocate of adoption, and I know how important home studies are and how important it is to vet those who are going to receive a child and make that child part of their home. Well, when the conveyance of that child is occurring in mass, and that's what has been happening, those kinds of very high bar standards are not even close to being fulfilled. So it would be easy for a scammer to get their hands on a kid to sexually exploit and/or labor exploitation, but we still seem to be woefully ill-informed about what about those kids.
The plight of the unaccompanied children who have, especially those who have been identified working in completely inappropriate workplace environments that has been reported in the news. It is heartbreaking. I do recall your interest and your passion for this subject, and I am happy to report what we have done most recently. In particular, the State Department works closely with our colleagues at DHS and HHS, who share responsibility for processing unaccompanied children and caring for them, placing them, and discharging them, hopefully, into loving and appropriate homes. We know that the increase in the reports of child labor violations, especially as we spoke about of migrant children, it is terrible in itself, and it is a risk factor for becoming a risk of trafficking in persons. This is something that actually we covered fairly significantly in the U.S. narrative of this year's Trafficking in Persons report. HHS is vetting and assessing sponsors, and they have in fact expanded their post-release services, and they are committed to expanding those post-release services to all of the children that have been placed with a sponsor. In particular, the Trafficking in Persons report, as we address this issue globally, we are specifically recommending increased funding so that all children have legal representation. Having access to a legal counsel will provide specific security and safety for them. Additionally, we, and I think this is something that you had brought up, are encouraging and recommending increased in-person wellness checks. As we know, the children that you have spoken about were individuals, they were with a sponsor that did not respond to a phone call. And so our Trafficking in Persons report is therefore recommending then in-person wellness checks for individuals that don't respond to a phone call.
If I can interrupt, is that being done now?
That is recommended in the report, and I do know
that doesn't take legislation. That just takes executive action. Why won't they do it?
What we know for sure is that HHS has already expanded the post-relief services, and they are seeking funding to expand them to all children. I think more specificity, I might need to refer to my colleagues at HHS, but I do know that they have, and this was reported in the Trafficking in Persons report as a positive development. There was a notable expansion of services, specifically post-release services to children.
Has there been any accountability for the 85,000? Have any been discovered to have been exploited? Have they been brought to a safe haven of some kind, whether it be with a a family or some government institution?
I
What
think
about those kids?
I think that the specific circumstances of the individual children would be something that maybe we would have to refer to my colleagues at HHS. I don't have access to the specific identifying information.
Could you make that inquiry? I mean, you are the top tip person, and
Yes, and as you
we
know,
believe in our own neighborhoods, these kids are being horribly mistreated. We don't know. They're probably very afraid to come forward. And, you know, in the FY 2023 amount, 15 million, that was reduced. It was 18 million in 2022, so it looks like there's even less money available for this. So, but I don't think it's a matter of money. I think it's a matter of prioritization and saying, if that were my child, heaven and earth would be moved before I would say, oh, that person is okay. When you have any kind of doubt whatsoever, again, using the model, if I could, of adoption. I mean, we do vigorous vetting with adoption. Even there's problems, but they're mitigated because of that vetting process. So if you could get back to us with that, it would be extraordinary.
yes, as you know, we work closely through this Senior Policy Operating Group, and in fact, some of these improvements that were noted in the TIP report were discussed in those meetings, and we are happy to follow up on that.
Okay, thank you. You know, you mentioned the Senior Policy Operating Group. COVID taught us that many of these purveyors of harm to children quickly during COVID-19 went to using the internet and using it very effectively to recruit, groom, and ECPAT did one report after another and exposed. And we also, you know, like a chorus called out for more protection for these kids. And I'm just wondering, what do you think needs to be done to further protect kids from that kind of online exploitation where they're groomed? I mean, we saw in one instance there was a grooming that took place within an hour. You know, the person befriended this vulnerable young girl, and next thing you know, she was being exploited. It equally goes for the boys too, where these people are masters and very masterful at exploiting people. What are we doing on that front?
As the Trafficking in Persons report has noted, and as you have said, we have definitely seen an increase in online sexual exploitation of children, sex trafficking of children, and child sexual abuse material in both the U.S. and other countries post-COVID. And we absolutely acknowledge that social media can be used to allure kids. This is one of the reasons that the TIP report highlighted the introduction focusing on technology and its impact on trafficking and how it can be used for good and also for bad. Specific to your questions, we recommend that parents, government, tech companies, and media partner. We believe that there should be a prioritization on education so that children have online safety tools. Additionally, if kids are online, we are suggesting and promoting that perhaps developing and utilizing online tools and meet them where they are. We also know that technology can be used for good. It can help identify victims. It can help victims self-report, and it can help victims access service and know about service. There are a couple of examples of where technology has been used for good that I will flag. One is the Trafficking in Persons Office has supported the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children, who are using a multilingual virtual training to provide much needed training on how to use technology in many different languages to thousands of criminal justice professionals. I will also highlight the very successful Child Protection Compact that was focused on Philippines and specifically on online sexual exploitation, which has seen a measurable decrease in that crime. So I think that this is an opportunity for us to be aware of how it can be dangerous, but also utilize how it can be effective. And there are a couple of other notes about this that are noted in the introduction, including IOM has a counter trafficking data collaborative, which makes data more available. And one other one, which I think is a good example of companies doing good. IBM has a traffic analysis hub, which uses AI data sets to help us better respond to this problem. I appreciate your interest, and that was exactly why we had the technology focus in our introduction to this year.
I'll just ask two others, and then in the second round, I have some additional questions, because out of deference to my good friend and colleagues, and ask them to take however much time they would like as well. With Cuba, you did mention, and we do know that Cuba is a situation where they forcibly send healthcare workers to other countries, and I'm wondering what those recipient countries are doing to ensure that they're not receiving a forced laborer coming to their shores. I remember years ago, I had a hearing in 2012 with Dr. Oscar Bichette, who was an OBGYN who was horribly mistreated by Fidel Castro, put in solitary prison. He was an OBGYN, like I said, and he was just an amazing man. He actually came and testified, not here, but on the island of Cuba, through a clandestine means. That's how brave this man is. And he talked about that and just how foolish the Western world is vis-a-vis Cuba in buying into these false narratives. And I'll give you an example myself. I nominated, I was one of many, but I led the effort in the Congress to have Liu Xiaobo named as the Nobel Peace Prize winner, and he got it. So I was there at the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony, dinner with some of the Nobel Peace Prize members of the parliament to do the actual selection. So I asked them all about Cuba. And they said, oh, they have a great health system and they export doctors. And I said, do you know those doctors go under duress? And that's putting it mildly. That they do not go voluntarily. They are forced. It's not like some benign, humanitarian initiative on the part of the Cuban government. It's a way of promoting their policies at the expense of these men and women who were forced into that service. I was amazed that they were so ill-informed about that. So, what are these other countries doing to say, if you're going to send us doctors, LPNs, nurses and the like, we want to make sure they're coming in an absolute voluntary fashion. Secondly, on Vietnam, I've chaired dozens of hearings on Vietnam, gone there many times. I remember when CPC was coming up, country of particular concern, and the Bush administration, in order to curry favor with them to get a trade deal, lifted the country of particular concern, even though the policies were egregious when it came to religious freedom, wiped it all out, gave it to them, and they said the day that they got the trade agreement, that there will be no linkage whatsoever to human rights, including religious freedom. I couldn't believe how brazen they were and how unappreciative they were to the kowtowing by George W. Bush, which he did, and I argued with them incessantly. I have been trying ever since to get that back. There's a parallel here, in my humble opinion, with trafficking. Because we want to curry favor with the Vietnamese government vis-a-vis China, for example, as maybe like a new China card, going back to the old Soviet Union mentality, we're willing to overlook very serious human rights abuses against journalists, on religious freedom, and torture and trafficking. And I've been arguing, I have a bill in right now called the Vietnam Human Rights Act. Zoe Lofgren is the Prince Democrat primary co-sponsor. We really believe it's a bipartisan effort. It's passed 3 times, gone over to the Senate, and holds get put on it because we're not going to tell them what to do on human rights. It's like if they have a good human rights policy, we want to applaud them, not hold them to account. I can't figure out why Vietnam is not a Tier 3 country. I followed very closely. Forced labor is a problem. Sex trafficking is always a problem, but forced labor is a problem. And even the first prosecution under my law, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, was against the Vietnamese government. Of all things, they never paid up. They never did anything. They just looked the other way and hoisted their finger at us in a very disrespectful way. So I can't get it. How do they get off, or how are they not on Tier 3? Those 2 questions.
I'll answer them in reverse order, sir. With regard to Vietnam, please know that our staff works all year. I know that the TIP report gets a lot of flurry of attention in June, but please know that our staff is working all year long to obtain as much information about countries as we can. We are working here in DC, but also our staff in the embassies around the world. And we are working to gather information from not only governments, but also all sources available, including NGOs, international organizations, open sources, and media. and then objectively assessing the information that we obtain against the minimum standards in the TVPA, and then specifically comparing that information to the year before. As you very well know, Vietnam was in a situation where they could not stay on the Tier 2 watch list. They had to go up or down this year. Our choice was putting them up to Tier 2 or down to Tier 3. When we looked at the information that we obtained from every different source throughout the entire year and compared it to how Vietnam did last year, they had improved from how they did last year. Specifically, we noted an increase in investigations, prosecutions, and convictions. But as we know, prosecution alone is not what we look at. We also saw an increase in victim identification and assistance to those victims. So the protection measure had increased. Specifically, of particular note is the online scam operations. Vietnam repatriated more than 4,000 victims from online scam operations. And they also consulted with NGOs and international organizations on their amended legislation. Now, they absolutely have a big improvement that they need to do, and this was very critically pointed out in the narrative, specifically regarding concerns about complicity. We noted that they closed the investigation and reinstated a person who was allegedly complicit in very harmful practices. Additionally, we also acknowledge and called out that they did not consistently screen and identify victims who were rescued, so to speak, from those online scam operations. But when we looked at the data that we obtained this year and compared it to last year as required by the TVPA, it was more appropriate to move them up than down when comparing those 2 years. I would love to turn my attention now to the first question that you asked me regarding Cuba, and I have to say that I had a similar situation as what you described. I had the benefit of meeting with several survivors of individuals specifically from Cuba's medical missions, and I met directly with these amazing heroes. Some of them had left that mission years before. Some of them had left only 1 or 2 years. So we had a huge range of age span. And it was really that meeting with them that inspired us to have a special interest box on Cuba and to more vehemently call this out and specifically state that the government of Cuba does profit from forced labor in their export program. It is in fact a significant revenue source. Obviously, as you well know, we have been raising these concerns since 2010, and it's been a policy and pattern country for 5 years. But what we have done this year is take that meeting with participants of this program and worked with them to develop survivor recommended suggestions and recommendations for countries who are going to participate in this program despite the severe concerns about forced labor. There are things that these survivors want them to do, and so we have taken that survivor-led recommendation list and shared it with every country that we know of who participates in that program. I'll give you an example of some of the information that's included in there, which means investigating the conditions regularly of these medical professionals, auditing any numbers or reports that the Cuban medical professionals may give you, contracting directly with the doctors rather than with the government of Cuba, making your agreement public, which is currently not done. And then the final thing that I'll say, just to make sure that we were using every opportunity that we had, I spoke personally with the special rapporteur on contemporary forms of slavery, Obokata, and the special rapporteur on trafficking in persons, Malele, so that we are organizing our efforts and being coalescing and really presenting a united front to address this terrible abuse. Thank you so much for asking me about it.
I would just point out that Vietnam, there was a June 24th Reuters story, and I'm sure you saw it, and the questions are being raised about Hanoi's accuracy, honesty in conveying information to us. And when you have a government that is known for abuse in a myriad of areas, there needs to be a sense of skepticism, healthy skepticism, to accept their numbers. And human rights groups have raised that with you, and I hope you take that back, and to compare it to last time they should have been tier 3. They should have been tier 3 for a number of times, because they are, and I'm worried that geopolitical considerations are crowding out the concern for human rights, and trafficking in particular, because of this other part of our geopolitical strategy for that area vis-a-vis China. So I do thank you for your answer, but if you could just keep that in mind. And Dr. Tong is here. I just wanted to point out he's a Boat People SOS that has been a great friend and advocate for the people of Vietnam. And just to get an example, I'm sorry for my colleagues for going on, but back when during the Clinton administration, they wanted to forcibly repatriate people who were part of the comprehensive plan of action. They were numbers of people deployed all over Asia, including and I went to different refugee sites, including High Island in Hong Kong. And we were forcibly sending people back saying they're not refugees. And he came forward, he being Dr. Tong, with credible, actionable information that there was a corruption rampant in the selection process. I did an amendment on the floor that passed that ensured that we did it, that we didn't have somebody else contracted out, and 20,000 people came over. But I had 4 hearings on that, and the administration was adamant that no, these aren't refugees. They have repatriation monitors that are waiting when they come to Vietnam. No re-education camp for them. Instead, they will be monitored. So I had a hearing with the monitor, one of them. There were only 7, and I said, "Who accompanies you when you're in that village or town or whatever it might be?" And he said, "Well, the secret police." So do you think anybody is going to say, "Oh, by the way, I'm in for a horrible time here," when sitting right next to him is somebody from the secret police? Ain't going to happen. So Hanoi has a horrible reputation for dishonesty. I'd like to now yield to Dr. McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate you all being here today. This is an incredibly important topic, one of dire consequences for those people who are involved. I think we're all aware of it, and we all care very much so. So I would never accuse anybody of anything other than that. I think everybody here really cares. That's why we're here. With that said, I'd also like to take an opportunity to recognize Governor Kemp in Georgia and First Lady Marty for their efforts to clean up what we believe is a hub for child trafficking in Atlanta, which we've really tried to tackle and take it very seriously in our home state. I think it's interesting, Ms. Ambassador, that we're currently in the Tier 1 category, I believe, correct? And
yes.
We've been there. Have we ever not been in Tier 1?
We have not.
Okay. And I think the Tier 2 category, I'm just going to read off the list of what it's defined as far as because we're researching what defines each category. Tier 2 is countries whose governments do not fully meet the Trafficking Victims Protection Act minimum standards, but are making significant efforts to bring themselves to compliance with those standards, and for which the estimated number of victims of severe forms of trafficking is very significant or significantly increasing, and their country is not taking proportional concrete actions. One thing that disturbs me, and I mentioned before that I'd just come back from Bangladesh and Cox's Bazar, where they have 1 million people there, and they're in Tier 2, and I'm sure Malaysia is even worse. I didn't see them, Myanmar, I didn't even see them on the list, but I'm sure they're not doing well. You have 1 million people, but each person has strict accountability. We can literally keep track of every single person there. Why? Because they have to subsist on $8 per person per month. So they track that pretty incredibly strictly, right? So we have good accountability people. Here in the United States, we lack the same accountability. One thing that disturbs me greatly is we have a southern border. We've had at least 10 million people come across in the last few years. Of that, at least in the 21-22 era, we had 85,000 children come across, which a significant portion of them were handed over to people. We have no idea who they are in relationship to the children. We stopped the DNA testing. Which we knew at least around 9% were unrelated genetically. So then we stopped it for some reason. knowing that that's a problem, knowing that the coyotes and traffickers of children would use that against those children, we stopped testing people genetically. Single parents coming across who could be kidnapping their children from the other parent. We don't do anything about that. We have up to 70% of all women being sexually exploited as they come across the southern border. And we have 2 million that got away. We have no idea anything about them, including the children that get away. They haven't even been addressed. So how is it the United States is doing a good job and Bangladesh is doing a bad job in comparison? Because it seems a bit hypocritical to me.
Thank you. And you actually bring up a really good point that I want to take the opportunity to sort of clarify. The Trafficking in Persons report compares a government's efforts during the reporting period to how that government did during the previous reporting period. It doesn't actually compare countries to one another. The way that it was wisely set up is that we have metrics and pieces of data that we compare for this reporting period versus how that country did the reporting period before.
So addressing that, apples to apples, United States to United States. Before we tested people's DNA, before we had a secure border, before people weren't coming over and unaccounted for, before we didn't have 85,000 children coming across with no accountability, how are we not doing worse in our tier comparison to the previous years? That's my question.
In this reporting period, I'll tell you some of the specific pieces of data that we did consider in this analysis. One is that more money was spent for services. Another was that the administration deployed the most agents and officials ever.
Okay, I'm going to stop you right there because I hear this all the time. Money spent. How's it doing for schools? Money spent. How's it doing for the border? More border patrol agents to do what? Process people in. That's why they're not undocumented migrants. They're very well documented illegal invaders, just to make a point.
Allow me to give a different number. We had an increase in the number of federal prosecutions and an increase in the number of convictions for both sex trafficking and labor trafficking as compared to the year before. We also did...
How many by numeric standards did you have an increase in? How many more prosecutions numerically?
I do not have that figure in front of me, but I'm happy to follow up.
Okay, so I'm just going to make another point. When you have 10 million people come across the border, you have no genetic testing, you know that people are being sexually exploited, you don't know which children belong to who, I think that's a severe lack of accountability. I think it's hypocritical, and I think we need to stop with the cooking of the books. We need to have accountability. We should go back to genetic testing. We should not be encouraging people to come across the border masked by coyotes who basically exploit child trafficking, human trafficking, illegal drug trafficking. This is a catastrophe of the southern border that is absolutely, undeniably affecting children in the most negative and egregious ways. We should be ashamed of ourselves. And I don't think you're understanding my point when I'm saying we are not doing our job. As a tier 1 nation who's supposed to be leading the way, the United States, with all the technologies, all the things we say we stand for, not giving children the right representation when it comes to accountability and making sure they are not raped and trafficked and taken away from their families because we just don't know. And that's the truth. And that's what I want to leave you with. Because I think unless you can explain how we have better accountability than we did 4 years ago, I just don't think it's worth the conversation until we can actually get back to that point.
I think that one of the things is that the president independently issued a proclamation which suspended irregular entry until the numbers of unlawful crossings had dropped. And he did this independently, and that is something that happened during this past reporting period, which was an improvement from the year before.
So he suspended what?
He suspended all irregular entries.
So there's no, what is a regular versus an irregular entry?
The border, in an effort to have a safe and humane and protected border, there is a requirement that if you want to present for seeking asylum or for some other reason, you have to utilize the CBP1 app and use it at a particular entry. And they are funneling in an effort to do really what you're saying, so that you have a better idea of who is coming in, so that people are not coming in without us knowing who they are. So there were efforts made. But I will also point out that this is also, we get our information about the government efforts, not just from what the government gives to us. We receive information from civil society organizations, NGOs, service providers.
I've been to the border.
And
I've seen
these
it, and
are-
I'm just going to interrupt you for a second, because we're kind of out of time. I want to respect Mr. Moylan's time, but let's get real. Because you filled out an app, because you said the child belongs to me, because you're a coyote or you're whomever, and you're maybe not related to a child, doesn't give me any confidence that we've improved accountability. I think it's all talk. It's all paperwork. It can all be absolutely cheated on. We have no better accountability. We don't know who these children are with. We don't know if they're related to them. I think we've been absolutely supporting a farce when it comes to accountability. It needs to stop now, and I'm going to end with that. Thank you.
Mr. Moylan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dyer, obviously, as my colleagues and the chairman has been discussing, these transnational criminal organizations, these TCOs, present big challenges for us, of course, and most countries just can't adopt to it, and especially in the Indo-Pacific area, which is my greatest concern. These groups are indifferent to national borders, as stated by my colleague here, and in groups like the Yakuza and the Chinese Triad and Southeast Asia criminal and terrorist groups. They just exploit international law to do their operations. They don't care. They really don't care. So, Mr. Dyer, how can we as the United States better leverage these resources that we have and coordinate better with global partners and adversaries, if we have to, within the Indo-Pacific on these common issues?
I think that there are a number of things that we can do to improve the situation that you have spoken about. One is through the information in the Trafficking in Persons report. That report attempts to highlight the challenges and the problems that you have laid out. As one example, knowing that the PRC is behind some of these transnational organizations, we have specifically called out their treatment of Uyghurs and other Tibetans, other minorities. Additionally, we have highlighted in the report the treatment of PRC nationals in the Belt and Road Initiative. And of course, we have highlighted the online scam traffickers. The online scam operation traffickers often have links to the PRC. But some of the things that we're doing to address this and actually try to create an improvement is exactly what you're talking about, which is regional cooperation. One of the things that I did when I was traveling in my travels, which I heavily focused on the region that was impacted by the online scam operations. Last year, I actually traveled to Thailand, where I had the opportunity to meet with Mr. Tower, Cambodia, Laos, Malaysia, and Singapore. But in Singapore, I gave the keynote address to the ASEAN governments. All ASEAN governments were represented, and I spoke about the issue of the online scam operations and the need to have greater regional cooperation. This is not something that we're going to be able to solve in a silo. It is definitely expanding, and we've got to have greater regional cooperation. One additional thing, in addition to speaking to that group, I have brought this issue up in my bilateral meetings and multilateral meetings, including with the Organization for Security and Cooperation and the Organization for American States. But one thing that we also listen to experts, and we try our best to do what they recommend. Experts like Mr. Tower, and I'm going to give you just 4 examples of things that we're doing to specifically address some of the online scam operations and these transnational criminal organizations. One, in Thailand, we're investing by assisting investigators to better utilize technology so that they can actually hold perpetrators accountable, but also to help with regional cooperation. In Laos, we are providing services for victims who are repatriated, who have come back from these online scam operations, and specifically training immigration officials in Laos to try to prevent victims from going and falling prey to these operations. Another regional effort that we are doing is focused on the Southeast Asia region, and it is focused on creating coordination and cooperation between criminal justice professionals so that better identification and referral of victims. And then the last thing, which is something that I was so happy to hear Mr. Tower mention it, we know that if the traffickers are using social media platforms and online digital technology, then so should we. And so we have a program specifically to raise awareness on social media platforms that the traffickers are using to fraudulently recruit, to put correct information out there, to flag fraudulent ads, to try to use the sources that the traffickers are using themselves. Because you're so right, sir, it's going to take all of us working together on this issue.
Appreciate that, and Mr. Tower, she just handed it over to you, but I have a specific question for you, by the way. So more likely than not, we have our national instability directly leads to an increase in domestic and transnational crime. So in relations to Myanmar, Mr. Tower, what does the current situation mean for border nations like China, as well as the Indo-Pacific at large, for human trafficking and other illicit smuggling?
Thank you for the question. I think it's important to recognize that the February 1st, 2020 military coup perpetrated by the Myanmar army has been a key factor in enabling a lot of this rise in criminal activity that you're seeing in Myanmar, but also really reverberating across the region. You saw where before the coup, the democratically elected government, the NLD, was on a trajectory to really crack down on some of this criminal activity. So many of the casino cities, which were the precursors to the scam compounds that now line Myanmar's borders, they were under significant pressure from the democratically elected government. And the NLD government also had called out the role that Chinese criminal groups were playing, trying to advance some of these large-scale criminal enclaves as a part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. So they actually pushed back. By August of 2020, you saw where the PRC actually openly disassociated the BRI from some of this criminal activity in response to the NLD's efforts. Following the coup, all of that really was undone, and you've seen where in Myanmar these casino cities have turned into some of the largest places in the region where you have really criminal actors perpetrating these online scams using forced labor in impunity. The China border was completely lined with these scam syndicates. The Thai border, you've seen where they've continued to grow because of the conditions following the coup, where the Myanmar military has deployed the country's police to coerce the Myanmar people. It's really focused all of the country's resources on fighting a war against the population. And so that has played to the advantage of the criminal groups in that country. And in fact, the only way in which you've seen a crackdown on some of this criminal activity is when in the northern part of the country, some of the ethnic armed organizations actually decided to launch a armed operation referred to as Operation 1027. This happened up on the China border in October of last year. These ethnic armed organizations claim they had two goals. One was to eradicate scam centers, and the other was to eradicate the Myanmar military dictatorship. And they managed to disrupt roughly 300 of these scam centers in northern Myanmar. Unfortunately, most of the kingpins got away and relocated to the Myanmar-Thai border, or pivoted to Cambodia, or pivoted to Laos. And I think that illustrates both the challenges of dealing with these issues in Myanmar under the current conditions that have been created by the Myanmar military, as well as the ability of these criminal actors to pivot between different countries. So if you have these sort of bilateral types of crackdowns, or if you have a crackdown that really only touches on compounds in one particular part of the region, they're going to end up relocating in other areas.
Appreciate that. Just a final question for Mr. Dyer. So for my district of Guam, our proximity to countries with higher numbers of human trafficking cases represents a hidden threat. And with an increase in fentanyl, which we have a big increase on Guam, and illegal entries to the U.S. territories and bases in the Pacific, these TCO's influence is just bound to follow. So, Mr. Ard, what programs are in place to mitigate against Pacific TCO influence before they reach the shores of Guam, USA, and the Northern Mariana Islands of the United States?
With regard to the PRC influence, I think that we have a number of things in place that we are using where the Department of State participates with the interagency. For example, the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force. We have the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. I think if your question is pertaining, and there may be specific resources or support to the Northern Mariana Islands or to Samoa, that would probably come from the Department of Justice or the through the Office of Victims of Crime. My organization, as far as our programming money, can only go to countries outside of the U.S. And so we don't have programming in your area, but we do have programming in nearby areas, for example, the Philippines, that have been really successful. And we do have some regional programmings that could be of support for you and your compatriots.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Thank you, Mr. Tower, as well. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us. So good to see you. Some final questions. First, starting with China. I currently, and I've done this in the past for years, I chair the Congressional Executive Chinese Commission. It's a bicameral and includes executive branch individuals. It's a very robust, very focused on getting to the bottom of human rights abuse of all kinds in China. And we've had numerous hearings, and one of them was recently in October. It was a hearing on how forced labor on Chinese fishing vessels and in fish processing facilities taints America's seafood supply chain. Among our witnesses was Ian Urbina, who has done some amazing reporting that was carried by the New Yorker, and I'm sure you know and have read his stories, on China's deep sea fishing fleet and its human trafficking violations. One of the most shocking things our hearing revealed was the role of the U.S. government in subsidizing China's egregious labor rights abuses, primarily through procurement by DoD and also Department of Agriculture of tainted seafood. On U.S. military bases and federal prisons, and via the National School Lunch Program, fish tainted by forced labor is being bought with U.S. taxpayer dollars. If you ask these government procurers why they would do that, they point to price. There is an exception to the Buy America purchasing policy if prices are deemed unreasonable, and sure enough, when you are competing with seafood caught and processed by slave labor, you will be underbid every time. So in ostensibly complying with, quote, the law, our DoD, USDA, and others violate three laws that I can think of: Section 301 of the Trade Act, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, and the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, not to mention the letter, if not the spirit of the law of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. My question for you, and I wrote, and I was joined by Senator Merkley, who's my co-chair. I am the chairman, he's the co-chair, and we switch every 2 years with regards to who is the lead. I'm the lead in this Congress. And we jointly did a letter to all the agencies asking, why aren't you stopping this? Why aren't you applying the law? And we've got crickets back and no response of any meaningful fashion. I'm shocked by it, and shocked. My question is, what can you do with your office, particularly in these interagency meetings? I mean, our supply chain should be untainted by, and again, Ian did an amazing job at great risk to his investigators over the course of several years. They had them deployed to these ships any day, night. They could have been thrown overboard doing this reporting, and they found that the abuse was overwhelming to these, and it's all forced. They have no choice. Some of them are Uyghurs, and others are people from North Korea. Will the president consider signing an executive order, for example, banning the purchase of tainted seafood and applying U.S. law?
Thank you so much for bringing this up. I find the plight of fishermen, especially those that are on these distant water fishing vessels, to be particularly heartbreaking. They have, as you know better than anybody, they have often no access to fresh drinking water. They are subject to transfers at sea. They spend years and years away from land, and it is rife with opportunities for abuse. I too am a big fan of the Outlaw Ocean Project and have had the opportunity to speak with Ian Urbina and learn from his wise counsel. I'll tell you a few things that the Trafficking in Persons Office is doing to address the forced labor in the fishing industry. One is we do call it out in the Trafficking in Persons report. There are several countries that we are specifically not only identifying where it is occurring, but also making specific recommendations. For example, sometimes we are specifically recommending that countries do not allow transfers at sea, that make those individuals come back so that they have an opportunity to seek care if they need it. We are also active participants in the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force and in implementing the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. As you know, we have put many new entities on that, the UFLPA entity list, and I'm happy to tell you that just earlier in late June, we included a seafood processing company specifically from China. Recognizing your excellent point that there is abuse in this system. Many of these individuals are, as you said, Uyghurs. I know that I believe Ian Urbina has also pointed out the abuse of individuals from the DPRK in some of these seafood processing companies as well. So we are utilizing the law that Congress gave us, and we have seen that it is working. In fact, the UFLPA is causing countries, they are afraid of being put on that entity list. It's enough that I've even recommended when I'm engaging with multilateral or bilateral folks at the OSCE, I'm saying you better do this because it's working, and you don't want to be a dumping ground for things that we're not going to take. We're also, of course, not exclusively utilizing the UFLPA, also, of course, the withhold release orders. Thank you for mentioning the federal acquisition regulations, which are designed to prevent the import of goods made with forced labor. I know that this has come up in some of our forced labor enforcement task forces. There is now training for individuals in order to get certified to be an official under the FAR, the FAR. You have to have training on a regular basis about trafficking in persons. I also acknowledge that more needs to be done. This is an area, it is difficult to regulate the open seas. We are really working on coming up with a concise list of recommendations to give to countries the way that we have done, like those that are accepting individuals from the Cuban medical missions. We need to do a better job. We're certainly calling it out, but it is a challenge to regulate the open seas, and we are grateful for the tools that Congress has given us, and certainly trying to use all that we have.
You know, just on the Uyghur Forced Labor Act, I'm one of the 4 co-authors of it. Totally bipartisan. I've done a number of oversight hearings, and we're finding we have flaws in the very bill that we did. One of them is the de minimis amount of $800, where things coming out of Xinjiang, everything's under $800, and it's not. But there's no real effective capability, so we're looking at lowering it or getting rid of that very de minimis standard, which again you learn as you write laws. The other point that I'd like to, with regards to fishing, and one of the heroes recognized by TIP has pointed out in amendments to the Thai fisheries law, STF issued an open letter on June 25th, just a few weeks ago, and it basically talks about it's you know, they say how they want to work with the Thai government, but they also want to be very clear, because some of the recommendations that are coming forward by the Thai government look like they're going to be counter to protecting workers' rights. Allowing for the return of at-sea transshipment of catch and at-sea crew transfers, allowing children under the age of 18 to work on these ships, and there's a whole list. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but I'm wondering, what the response might have been from the Thai government on this, especially since one of the tip stars brought this out and has spoken about it so strongly.
I had an opportunity to meet that hero when I was traveling this past September, and she the woman I met was just truly inspiring. I think that I am tracking with your question. We know that Thailand had actually put into place some more strict laws as the result of sort of outrage and scrutiny that they had. We understand that they are concerned that their laws are stricter and therefore it's impeding their business. And so we understand from our NGO colleagues and CSO colleagues that there's a consideration of rolling back some of the restrictions that they had put into place. Ironically, I actually met with the new the new ambassador from Thailand to the U.S. and brought up this very issue in our bilateral engagements and just flagged it for him, because I know that it is a top of mind for our civil society organizations, and certainly something, these types of changes in laws are certainly things that we track and comment on in the Trafficking in Persons report as well.
Where is the administration on the sex worker? When the woman who heads up the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women makes such a strong statement, which I completely agree with, prostitution results in grave and multiple human rights violations such as torture, inhumane and degrading treatment, and violates the right of safety, dignity, and privacy, the highest standards of health, freedom of movement, and family. And she talks about that artificial distinction, and I've been talking about this ever since we did the original TVPA back in the 1990s. The line of demarcation between somebody who voluntarily is doing this versus a woman who was forced, fraud, or coercion, or has not attained the age of 18. That's simple, that's based on age. But the other is often absolutely blurred, and she makes that very point in her statement. And she says that terms like sex work sanitize the harmful reality of prostitution. What say you?
Like you, I am aware that there are some hard felt feelings on both sides of the use of that term. As far as the United States, and in my office, we do not use it. It is not found in our Trafficking in Persons report. I will point to one of the things that I read when I first had the opportunity to come on was the Advisory Council's annual report from, I think, 2020, where it gave a discussion about terms and which terms survivors preferred to use. And they also gave a really thoughtful discussion about why. I try to abide by the wise counsel of survivors. And so we have done that here. Of course, additionally, in the United States, we have in place National Security Directive 22, which is still in place, which says that the United States government opposes prostitution, and that it is not a legitimate form of work, and it is inherently harmful and dehumanizing and contributes to trafficking in persons. That's the USG National Security Directive. You and I both know that a lot of these laws are done at the state level. They're, as far as prostitution laws or terms that they use, some of it is done at the state level, but that's the position from the U.S. government.
Can I just ask you, Belgium's decriminalization, what impact, if any, did that have on their tier rating?
Belgium passed that law outside of the reporting period. That law passed on May the 24th. Our reporting period ended on March 31st. And so that law and any impact that law may have would be assessed in next year's report because it falls within that reporting period.
Please, thank you, and please assess it very vigorously. I mean, when the World Cup was in Germany, I did a series of hearings about prostitution where it is legalized in Germany. And frankly, I was shocked how, again, that line of demarcation between a voluntary so-called, and I have to say so-called prostitute, because there's no such thing in my opinion, and certainly not an underage, they don't exist. It is a form of sex trafficking, an egregious form. And the justifications that came from the German government were outrageous in my opinion. And I actually had women, when we were trying to get the TVPA passed, going way back, I had met a number of women in St. Petersburg, Russia with my wife. I brought a resolution up at the OSCE EPA, in 1989 this was. So we were with all these women who had been trafficked, and Miramed had rescued them and helped them, an NGO. And many of them went to Germany. And they told their stories, and I was, through tears, they told their stories. When we were having trouble with our legislation, two of them came here and told their stories before before my committee, you could have heard a pin drop. So anyone who has this fanciful, foolish view that somehow that is some kind of liberation, it is anything but. It's polar opposite. And those women made it very clear. So please be very vigorous in looking at Belgium during this next reporting period. And Mr. Dyer, thank you for your testimony. Sorry that I haven't had a whole lot of questions for you, but you're doing a great job. What is the China's complicity in the scam situation? If you could speak to that.
Yeah, so there are several different factors at play here. One is that the infrastructure where all of these scams are taking place inside of, you've seen where over the past 2 decades, many of these transnational criminal groups, they've actually built very close relationships with many elements of the Chinese state. This includes with Chinese state-owned enterprises, and I could cite many examples of this, but there are, just to pick one, in the Myanmar-Thai border, starting from 2017, you had a Chinese crime group that was headed by a wanted criminal from China that was openly associating with China's Belt and Road Initiative, and that gave a $350 million contract to a Chinese state-owned enterprise. And that is that infrastructure that was built between 2017 and 2019 is now one of the largest scam centers in the region. There are tens of thousands of people inside of this particular scam center. It was similar across the board, where many of these criminal actors, they masqueraded under China's BRI. They built close relationships with Chinese state-owned enterprises. In some cases, they even built relationships with Chinese planning bodies and with think tanks under those planning bodies who designed high-level plans for projects that even under China's own laws should be illegal. It's illegal for Chinese companies under Chinese laws to invest in casino cities overseas, for example, and yet that was happening with Chinese state-owned enterprises providing the infrastructure for it, and with some of these planning bodies in China playing a direct role in enabling all of this criminal activity. So in many ways, what you saw happen is that China created a Frankenstein monster. It empowered many of these criminal actors. It openly collaborated with them, and it enabled them to build this web of influence across the region, such that the criminal actors now have been able to begin even stealing money from across China. In addition to the US now being one of the largest sources or largest countries targeted by scammers, you had many people from across China also targeted by the same scams. This continues today with many of the criminal kingpins that are behind these various networks operating scam centers in Southeast Asia, but then also openly putting information about those scam centers onto platforms like TikTok. And here I would highlight the example of Wang Kok Koi, also known as Broken Tooth, who is a convicted triad leader who in 2020 initiated another of the large scam centers in Myanmar. This individual lives in China. He seems to launder his funds back into China. The US government has actually placed sanctions on this individual, and yet he is still openly, he kind of operates as something of a criminal influencer on TikTok, very active on that platform. So this illustrates another way in which the PRC continues to enable some of this activity. And then lastly, you see where the Chinese law enforcement approach to this, the crackdown to this, it's targeting individual scammers who scam in China. And this creates incentives where the scam syndicates are targeting Chinese nationals less, and they're pivoting to target others around the world, which is harmful for the US, it's harmful for the rest of the globe. And this is another, I think, way in which China's approach to this is causing harm to other countries.
Ambassador Dyer, just two things final. Going back for decades, and then most recently I've chaired hearings on people who investigate on behalf of a company in China, their workplace operation to determine whether or not, it may not be ILO standards, but whether or not abuse is occurring, whether or not arrearages are occurring in terms of paying salaries, workplace occupational hazards and the like. And it turns out that much of it is a big fat scam. These people go in, they talk to someone, hey, you over there, tell me, how's it going? You think they're going to talk again with management, which could be very illogical, which probably is Chinese Communist Party directed. They're not going to be forthcoming because there's no job protection when that investigator walks out. So we did a hearing on it. I did one years ago. We looked at Apple and some of these other companies, and it's one big fat scam. And I just can't believe that's not being discussed more. And I would encourage you, because that's a form of human trafficking of a very high order. When all of these products are being made, so many, not all, coming here to our shores, and they're being done as slave labor type situations. And these auditors sit there and go, okay. And I've read several auditors' reports, and frankly, I was shocked at how, I asked questions about it, and then we had the hearing on it just recently. So please take a good, strong look at that, especially with regards to the PRC. Any new sanctions coming towards China? Because it's sanctions time now. You got to report about sanctions.
I'm glad you asked about sanctions. As a former prosecutor, I love a powerful accountability tool, and we know that this is a powerful tool to promote both human rights and accountability. I will tell you that we are looking to support its use where appropriate. We even have now on staff in the Trafficking in Persons Office a senior sanctions policy advisor who is looking at various authorities to target individuals and entities. Currently, that individual has identified and is examining several priority sectors to potentially use this authorization. I will look forward to giving you more information.
Who is that?
It's a senior.
No, but who is it?
Oh, his name is Patrick Reed.
I'd love to meet with him.
Yes, he is so smart. You would
great.
love to meet with him. He is so smart. We are really working aggressively on this, have identified several priority sectors, and would be happy to give you further information in a different setting at a later time.
Thank you. And the trafficking report, for decades, it has been printed in a very presentable fashion. I give it out to every delegation I meet with. I encourage my colleagues to do the same. As special representative for the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, I bring hundreds of copies when I go and hand them out, and it not just singles out the country of the participant you're talking to. You're from Germany, you're in here too, so are we. But it gives them an idea of just the scope and the breadth of the work that's being done here, and that there is an accountability factor, and when it's just online or in a much more truncated version like this one, I mean, the other one is 4 times thicker with lots of very good narrative and information. I encourage you to please go back to the other format. Cost may be something. Please tell us exactly what it is. We'll try to get the appropriators to put in a line item if it's necessary. But it is a very useful tool. People don't necessarily go online. I do for this because it's not sitting in a book the way it used to be. But it's a great source. And again, when somebody's talking to somebody, says, look, even when Thailand was very upset with Burma. No, not Burma. It'll come. Because on the fishing industry, they were getting a very, Thailand, the bad mark, and the other wasn't. They were getting red carded by the European Union for all of this, but it was for one reason, geopolitical again. It was because of the trade partnership agreement, and you can't be on the list if you. Malaysia is what I'm talking about, and it was just very discouraging. But what did they do? They looked through the book. Yeah, they could do it online too, but they're going back and forth. Please go back to printing it.
I hate making decisions that you don't like, sir. I think that as part of the department's modernization efforts, as well as just the trend across government that has been going on since 2011, there was an executive order that told us print less and presume it's all going to be online. As you said, we experimented last year with the last year that was fully printed was 2022. That had the one that you liked with all of the country narratives. We experimented last year with just printing the introduction, and we still suffered with significant delays in the printing. And it is partially the cost.
Get a new printer.
It is, the length and the delays have made it super frustrating for us. And right now, we stand out as an outlier. We are the only congressionally mandated report that the State Department still has done in a print form. And in truth, I know that you use it, truly use it, and like it, and I think a lot of people certainly do, but the demand just isn't there for printed reports as it used to be. People don't want to have a heavy book that they have to take on the plane when it's available online, and we are trying to make the online version more accessible. It's searchable. We'll have a PDF up there so you can search Cuban export or whatever it is that you're interested in. And so we are trying to, while taking away something that I know that you love, hoping to replace it with something that you will come to love. And I appreciate
PDF isn't available now, is it?
it will be if it's not already. It takes a little longer to get it formatted. And so if it's not up yet, it will be. Thank you, sir.
Anything else you want to add before we conclude the hearing? Oh, sanctions, new sanctions.
I shared with you the information about the sanctions that I have. Oh, so sorry.
I did look at you. It's okay. You think we should do new sanctions vis-a-vis China? Let's see what the Treasury Department.
I think one thing that I've observed is that if you go back to December of last year, there was an announcement made to have some coordinated sanctions that involved the US, the UK, and Canada, targeting some of the perpetrators that were behind the forced labor scamming across Southeast Asia. The UK actually did place sanctions on some of the Chinese origin, the representatives of some of these Chinese origin crime groups, as well as representatives of the Myanmar Army's Border Guard Force, as well as some of the other elites across Southeast Asia, including in Cambodia, that are responsible for the forced labor scam syndicates. I think you've not yet seen sanctions put out in quite the same way by the US, although I would note that there were some of the same individuals that are involved that are targeted by earlier sanctions for other crimes. So for example, in Laos, Jiawei has been sanctioned by the US, or I mentioned earlier the sanctions on Broken Tooth, who's another key Chinese criminal involved in this. But there are many additional targets, I think, that are there that, for example, now the UK has targeted, including some of these individuals deeply involved in Myanmar and in Cambodia and other parts of the region, as well as many of the Chinese criminals and other enablers behind these crimes. So it would seem that sanctions could be one tool whereby which additional pressure could be placed on some of those involved in perpetrating the crimes, and which could also potentially, if done in coordination with allies and partners, could really, I think, put more pressure on this broader criminal industry that is increasingly causing so much harm around the globe.
Okay. Well, again, thank you both, and the hearing is adjourned.